Alright, welcome back. Everything you need for Unit 2, Interaction Among Branches of Government, right now. Let's do it. Alright, so we're going to start with Congress. Before we do, make sure you hit that like button right as we start so you don't forget. Okay, so the House of Representatives has 435 members, and it is based on population, so each representative serves a specific district within a state. They serve 2-year terms, and the House of Representatives is more formal and more rules-based than the Senate. The Senate has 100 members. That's 2 per state, so every state is represented equally in the Senate. Senators serve 6-year terms, and the Senate is less formal and less rules-based than the House is. Alright, so what about the powers and functions of each? So let's start with the House. The House of Representatives initiates all tax and revenue bills. The House also has the power of impeachment. The House also has a Rules Committee. This provides an additional step in the legislative process that does not exist in the Senate. So this Rules Committee, they set the rules for debate when the bill comes to the floor. They can make it easier or more difficult for legislation to pass. The House can form itself into something known as a committee of the whole. So essentially the House will turn itself into a committee temporarily with all 435 members. They'll vote as a committee, so this can help legislation pass faster. Alright, the Senate, on the other hand, they have confirmation power. So they can confirm nominations made by the president. They can also ratify treaties. Now, a major difference with the Senate is that the Senate can have filibusters. So because there's no time limit and because there's no requirement to remain on topic, a senator can speak for as long as and about whatever he or she wishes. The purpose is to prevent a bill from being voted on. But how can the Senate end the filibuster? The term for that is cloture. It is a 3/5 vote, so that's 60 out of 100 of a full Senate would need to vote to end debate on that bill. That would end the filibuster forcibly, and then the bill would be able to be voted on. The result of this is that in the Senate, to pass controversial, wide-ranging legislation, it often requires a filibuster-proof supermajority, meaning 60 members, so that you can end the filibuster. Similarly, senators can issue a hold. A hold acts much like a filibuster does in that it prevents the bill from being debated or discussed or voted upon. So hold and filibuster slow and delay action, make it tougher to pass things. On the other hand, there is something called a unanimous consent agreement, which the Senate can pass, again, to speed along the process so they can say, all right, here are the rules we're going to set, and unless there is unanimous agreement, then we're going to keep moving the process along. All right, well, what about leadership in Congress? Well, it's important to talk about congressional committees. And the most important type of committee is known as a standing committee. Standing committees are permanent. They are where bills are first sent, where they then will edit and revise, mark up the bill, debate it. Most bills die right there and never come out of this stage. Standing committees are also in charge of overseeing bills once they have actually been passed. They oversee the executive branch to make sure that those bills are being enforced correctly, and that's known as congressional oversight. Committee chairs are the leaders of committees, and they are always from the majority parties. The majority party also gets to have the Speaker of the House. So this is the most powerful person in the House of Representatives. Again, they take the lead for setting the agenda and making sure that his or her party's policies actually get passed. In the Senate, we want to consider leadership, and there's somebody known as the President of the Senate, and the AP test likes to ask about this. That is the Vice President of the United States. That person is officially the President of the Senate. The only time this job actually matters is if there is a tie-breaking vote, but otherwise they aren't involved in the day-to-day operation of the Senate. The Senate Majority Leader is the most powerful person in the Senate. They are like the Senate's version of the Speaker of the House. And the Senate Majority Leader, just like the Speaker, they will be from the majority party. So again, you see the role of political parties in these leadership positions. So one of the most important powers Congress has is the power of the purse. So this is their ability to spend money and to raise money. Now, talking about the spending money part, there's 2 types of federal spending: discretionary and mandatory spending. Discretionary spending must be approved annually. Every year, Congress will make a budget, and they will then appropriate money for certain things. If Congress does not pass a budget for discretionary spending, then that money won't be spent. It won't take place. So Congress has control, along with the president, to increase or decrease this amount year to year. On the other hand, we have something known as mandatory spending. Now, this is money that Congress does not have to approve and appropriate year to year. This will happen automatically without congressional action. So if Congress does nothing, it will simply take place. What's important for you to know is that over 2/3 of all federal spending today is considered mandatory spending, and it is most commonly on entitlement programs. Entitlement programs provide benefits to people who are entitled to them by law. The best examples of entitlement programs are things like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. So the law says that if you are this age and you meet these certain qualifications, then you will receive Social Security or Medicare. Congress can change mandatory spending, but to do so you would need new legislation, and it is often difficult and extremely controversial to change these programs because remember, a lot of people are getting benefits from these programs. Along with that, we have pork barrel legislation, laws that provide for tangible benefits, jobs, programs, money, back to a congressman's district. Hand in hand with that is logrolling. So this is vote trading. You vote for mine, I vote for yours. Alright, so when we talk about congressional behavior, there are 3 models of representation. There is delegate, trustee, and politico. Alright, so if the person's acting as a trustee, that means that they believe it is their duty to vote the way that he or she thinks is right, even if it goes against what his or her constituents want them to do. A delegate, on the other hand, they would go to Congress and they would vote the way their constituents want, even if they personally might disagree. Politico is the idea that sometimes you act as a trustee and sometimes you act as a delegate. Alright, so now we need to consider how the districts get made. So we have a few things to deal with. One is we know the House is based off of population. So every 10 years we have a census and then reapportionment takes place. And this is changing the number of seats that each state has in the House of Representatives to make sure that it is still proportional according to population. Once that's taken place, now the maps need to be redrawn. The term for that is congressional redistricting. That's the redrawing. And that is done by the state legislatures. When they do this in a bizarre shape to benefit their party, that is known as gerrymandering. That is legally allowed. What's not allowed is malapportionment, and that's because of Baker versus Carr. So you cannot have districts of very unequal size. One other limit on drawing the districts is that they cannot be drawn based only on race. So there can be no racial gerrymandering, and that's because of Shaw versus Reno. Alright, in our last couple terms with Congress, we have something known as divided government. This is the idea that between the President, the Senate, and the House, at least one of them is a different party than the other. When we have divided government, that will lead to policy gridlock. That is where it is slower, more difficult for legislation to pass. We will have tougher confirmation hearings. We will have less legislation passed. We'll have fewer people being confirmed to jobs. Tougher to get things done in government. Alright, so let's turn our attention to the presidency, and specifically an expansion of presidential powers. So presidents rely on both formal and informal powers. Formal powers include the power to veto, where he would send back that legislation to Congress and reject it, preventing it from going into law unless Congress is able to override that veto with a 2/3 vote, but that only happens about 4% of the time, so this veto power is quite strong. The president can also pocket veto a bill. Now, this can only occur when he gets the bill within the last 10 days of the session of Congress. The president simply does nothing, and that bill does not become a law. And the president is commander-in-chief. That means he is head of the armed forces, so this gives him tremendous power in foreign policy. Now, increasingly, presidents rely more and more on their informal powers. So one example is executive agreements. So this is an agreement that a president would make with a foreign head of state, and it would be just like a treaty, but the benefit to the president is it does not require Senate ratifications. Presidents also issue executive orders. Now, these have the power of law, and they do not require congressional approval. Now, the Constitution does not directly state that executive orders are a thing, but every president since George Washington have used executive orders, and so this is a real way that presidents manage the bureaucracy and make foreign policy typically. Presidents also are increasingly reliant on signing statements. So, when the president gets a bill from Congress, oftentimes he'll go through the bill and essentially write notes on the bill saying what parts he approves or disapproves of and how he interprets it. And then we have the presidents rely on bargaining and persuasion. So they have to bargain with Congress because they rely on Congress to pass legislation that they can then approve of. They really can't get very much done in domestic policy without Congress. And then persuasion, again, they rely on Congress, so they need to persuade not just congressmen, but the public to be on their side, because a popular president is more likely to be able to get stuff done and more likely to be able to convince Congress to do something he wants. Now, the way that this is all set up leads to some natural tension between Congress and the president. When you think about things like confirmation, The president nominates people to jobs like federal judges, Supreme Court and lower court judges, people like ambassadors and diplomats and cabinet secretaries. The president nominates these people, but then the Senate confirms them. And so this can lead to some tension and again to negotiation and compromise. Speaking of, judicial appointments are a president's longest lasting influence because they get that job for life, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. But the fact that they have that job for life means that this is a hugely consequential decision, and presidents desperately want to get judges confirmed that they agree with, and that will rule in a way that the president would probably agree with as well. Now, there are some positions that do not require Senate confirmation, and so then you can avoid this tension. So members of the White House staff and White House office, so his domestic and foreign policy advisors, his chief of staff, his press secretary, his speechwriters, president can choose whomever he wants without Senate confirmation. And the last two things we want to consider with the president are ways that presidential communication has changed over time. We have presidents who rely heavily on the bully pulpit. This is the idea that because they are president, people will pay attention to what they say and do. So presidents have a unique ability to always command the public's attention, which they can then use to put pressure on Congress to do what the president wants them to do. Similarly is the State of the Union address. Once a year, the president gives a speech to Congress in which he outlines what has happened in the country over the last year and what he wants to occur going forward into the future. He's trying to get the public on his side so that they will then put pressure on their congressmen to support the president. And again, in modern times, you see the way communication changes, so using social media, reacting very quickly, going right to the people has proven to be a very effective strategy of presidents, just avoiding the news media, just going right to the people. All right, so next up is the judicial branch. Article 3 of the Constitution gives them their powers, but is really vague and doesn't say very much. So we end up really relying on Marbury versus Madison and Federalist No. 78 to tell us about the judicial branch. The really quick and easy version is that Hamilton is arguing for judicial independence. He is saying that we need to make sure that the judicial branch is not reliant on the other two branches for their job or for their pay, because we need the judicial branch to check the power of the other two branches. So his solution is to give them life tenure, so they cannot be fired or have their pay cut because of the decisions they're making. He says this is important because they need to rule in a neutral, unbiased way, and sometimes they need to use that power of judicial review to strike down unconstitutional laws made by Congress. Now, where does this judicial review power come from? In Marbury versus Madison, the court does say, and oh, by the way, we have the power to rule things unconstitutional, because if a law goes against the Constitution, it is our job to say that the Constitution is greater than the law. Now, when justices are making their decision in a particular case, they often will look to past decisions. It's known as a precedent. So a precedent is a ruling that will influence future cases that are similar. And the term, there's a Latin term for this, it's called stare decisis. It means that the court should follow precedent. Now, the court does not have to follow precedent, but it often does. But it is important to note that it is free and allowed to overrule itself and to change its mind and create new precedents, and it does do that from time to time. However, typically the court does rely on this principle and does in fact follow precedent most of the time. So now we're going to talk about two judicial philosophies: judicial activism and judicial restraint. Judicial restraint is the idea that the court shouldn't be very powerful, that it should defer to the democratically elected branches of government. Judicial activism, on the other hand, says no, it's our job to use judicial review, it's to protect the Constitution and to defend rights that might be being violated by the majority. So even if a democratically elected majority wants to do something, that doesn't mean it's okay. So they will actively use their power to make policy. All right, and lastly, we are to the federal bureaucracy. So we're kind of coming back to the executive branch. So we know the job of the executive branch is to enforce the law. President is just one person. He can't do that by himself. So we have this massive bureaucracy at the federal government. And what it does is it actually enforces and implements the federal laws that Congress passes. So these are the people who do the day-to-day job. People who work in the lower levels of the bureaucracy, the day-to-day jobs, these are not political jobs. They are just career employees working a job like anybody else. The top level positions usually are politically appointed. Now we have something known as the merit system, which is designed to end the era of political patronage. So the merit system means the way that those non-political people get their job is that they earn it, they qualify for it. They might have passed a civil service exam that says that you qualify for this job. The old days was political patronage, so you would get that job because of who you knew, or because of who you voted for. It can be very politically corrupt. So this is something that has promoted the idea of expertise and neutrality within the bureaucracy and is probably a step in the right direction. All right, so within the bureaucracy, we have 4 different types of bureaucratic agencies. Cabinet departments are by far the largest, and they have major responsibility over a broad area of policy. Next, we have executive agencies, and what they do is they provide a public service. So the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, is a great example of an executive agency. We also have independent regulatory commissions. Now their area is a little bit more narrow than cabinet departments, but they are able to make rules and regulations, try to regulate a specific industry or sector of the American economy. Government corporations, on the other hand, they provide some kind of service that could be done by a private business, but is not, because it does not appear to be profitable. So the government decides to do this instead. And so they provide that service. All right, so let's hit pause on the video right now. See this multiple choice question? Answer it down below in the comments. All right, and then when you're ready, move on and keep watching the rest of the video. So we have 4 main tasks of these federal agencies. They both write and enforce regulations. So they have the power to use some discretion to make regulations themselves. So they have some lawmaking power. It's not technically called a law. It's called a rule or a regulation, sometimes known as administrative law. And then they enforce these as well. So that is quite a bit of power these bureaucratic agencies have. They also punish violators, most commonly by issuing fines. They also testify before Congress. And then lastly, we have that they are part of issue networks and iron triangles. So let's talk about each of those a little bit more. Iron triangles are made up of congressional committees, interest groups, and bureaucratic agencies. So you have this idea of bringing all 3 together to make and influence policy. So you have the interest group, which is representing the public side of things, so we want certain rules to be made. You have Congress, congressional committees represented, and they are the ones who actually make the law. And then you have the bureaucratic agencies represented. They are the ones who will be enforcing the law and who will be making the specific regulations that go along with that law. So really this is like a symbiotic relationship, where the interest groups, what they can offer is electoral support to congressmen. The congressmen can provide favorable legislation to the interest group, and they can provide funding to the bureaucratic agency, and the agency can make rules and regulations that please the interest group and that please Congress. So each side is getting something out of it, and they are giving something to the others as part of this exchange. Issue networks, the same idea, but they are just a looser, more informal relationship. All right, and so lastly we come to that idea of congressional oversight. So this is when congressional committees, standing committees, specifically hold hearings and investigate the executive branch. This can be the president himself, the administration, or specific agencies and departments. So what they want to make sure is that those agencies are doing their job properly. They are enforcing the law the way that Congress intended for them to do so. The most common way that they exercise this oversight function is through committee hearings. So they require the high-level members of these committees to come and to testify before their committee and again inform them on what's going on, and they can decide whether or not they are pleased with what they hear. They then have the power of the purse, which means they can either increase or decrease that agency's budget depending on whether they like or don't like what they're hearing. Alright, it's a lot of information, but until next time, this has been a LaMoneyProduction. Alright, thanks again for watching this video. Make sure that you subscribe if you haven't already. Hit that like button for me. You know I appreciate it so much. Thank you guys. I'll see you in the next video.